Have you ever caught yourself pulling back from something, not because you truly couldn't do it, but because anxiety convinced you not to try? What if you could move through that moment by acting as if anxiety wasn't in charge? Welcome back to Quieting Anxiety, a podcast by Excel at Life. I'm Dr. Monica Frank, and in this episode, I will discuss an exposure technique called acting as if. It's not about pretending. It's not about faking confidence or ignoring anxiety. It's about stepping into the behaviors that align with your values and plans, as if anxiety weren't calling the shots. And when done with intention, it becomes a powerful way to reduce avoidance and retrain your brain's anxiety response. Let's start this episode with a brief moment of mindful imagination. If you're comfortable, close your eyes, or simply soften your gaze and take a slow breath. Now picture a situation where anxiety often interferes. Maybe it's something social, something work-related, or even something small that feels big in the moment. As you imagine that situation, ask yourself, if anxiety didn't get in the way, if it didn't shape my decisions or limit my behavior, what would I do differently? Visualize it in detail. How would you carry yourself? What would you say? What action would you take? Just observe what comes up. This isn't about pretending you feel calm. It's about seeing what might be possible if you weren't limited by anxiety. Try to notice the difference in how you feel in this imagined version, not because the anxiety is gone, but because you're not letting it steer the ship. Now take one more breath and gently bring yourself back. Just a quick note before we begin. Exposure techniques can be incredibly effective, but it's not something to take on alone. When it's done without the right support, it can backfire, sometimes making anxiety worse instead of better. That's why it's so important to work with a qualified mental health professional who understands how to guide the process safely. What we talk about here is for learning and reflection, not a substitute for personalized treatment. In this episode, we're focusing on an impactful cognitive behavioral technique known as act as if. It might sound like pretending, but in CBT, it's something more precise. Act as if means engaging in the behavior you would do if anxiety wasn't interfering. Not waiting until you feel confident or don't have anxiety, but doing it anyway. It's not about suppressing anxiety or faking confidence. It's about learning through action. And importantly, this is a form of exposure therapy, a behavioral method for reducing learned anxiety responses. When you engage in behaviors that challenge avoidance, you're training the brain that you can handle discomfort and that you don't need to be controlled by fear. So how does act as if work? Let me give you a personal example. Years ago, I was terrified of public speaking. I knew avoidance would only strengthen that fear. So I forced myself to choose public speaking whenever possible. If a college class gave me the choice of giving a talk or writing a paper, I chose giving the talk. In this situation, act as if meant giving the talk without the focus on the anxious thoughts, and instead focusing on the talk and my audience. It did not mean that I no longer had anxiety, but with exposure to public speaking, my anxiety was reduced. In addition, cognitive changes occurred so that I interpreted my anxiety as wanting to do well. In other words, if a particular talk created more anticipatory anxiety, It just meant that it might be more important to me, and I needed to prepare more. I didn't feel brave, I didn't feel calm, but I acted as if I could do it. And eventually, not only did the anxiety decrease, but I developed confidence in public speaking. That's the exposure part of this. By doing the thing I feared while still feeling anxious, I taught my brain that I didn't have to avoid it. That's what real progress often looks like. Not feeling less anxiety at first, but changing your response to the anxiety. This method is grounded in mindfulness. When you act as if, you're not denying the presence of anxiety. You're simply choosing to focus your attention on the task at hand rather than the anxious thoughts. By mindfully being aware of anxiety but not acting upon it, anxiety becomes more of what it is supposed to be, a messenger, not a controller. You might be in a meeting and you feel your heart racing, but instead of focusing on that feeling or sitting near the exit just in case, you act as if you're simply there to contribute, just like anyone else. That kind of presence, shifting your focus outward rather than inward, is a mindful redirection. It doesn't mean you're ignoring your anxiety, you're acknowledging it, but not giving it the steering wheel. One of the biggest misconceptions about this method is that it means faking it. But this isn't about becoming some idealized version of yourself. You're not acting extra confident or over the top. You're doing what you would normally do if anxiety weren't pulling you back. In other words, you're aiming for normal behavior, not extraordinary behavior. This might mean going to a gathering and engaging in conversation, even though your stomach is in knots. You're not pretending to be bubbly or outgoing. You're simply choosing not to let anxiety keep you home. I want to address another common misunderstanding about the act as if method. Sometimes people are told to just go into the situation and act as if they're not anxious, without any preparation. But if you've been listening to these podcasts, you already know we don't just throw ourselves into situations blindly. Acting as if is a structured exposure technique, and it involves more than just pretending or pushing through. If you have been avoiding situations, you may not know how to engage in those situations. So suddenly putting yourself into a situation with the directive, act as if you are confident, is likely to fail. So let me walk you through the steps that lead to success with this method. Step 1 is to define the behavior. This works best as a written exercise because writing brings clarity. Ask yourself, what behavior would I like to engage in if anxiety weren't in control? Be specific. And be careful here. Not about how you want to feel or what you want to think, but the actual behavior. What would someone see you doing if you weren't caught in the anxiety loop? For example, instead of saying, I want to feel more confident, write, I want to make eye contact, speak up in the meeting, and share my ideas. Step 2 is to break the behavior into simple, manageable steps. Just like with any exposure hierarchy, we don't start at the top. If your goal is public speaking, you might begin by asking a question in a small group, or even practicing your voice in front of a mirror. Each small behavior builds your tolerance and your skill. And importantly, you're exposing yourself to the anxiety that arises as you do each one. So the learning happens gradually, and you build confidence through real experience. Step 3 is to practice deliberately. Act as if doesn't mean diving into the hardest situation right away. It works best when practiced gradually, starting with lower anxiety situations and building from there. Don't expect yourself to automatically behave differently just because you've decided to act as if. You need rehearsal. You can practice in real life with a friend or even through imagery. Visualize yourself acting as you would if you weren't anxious. Picture yourself sitting calmly, responding thoughtfully, engaging in the moment. And again, focus on the behaviors. What does confident body language look like for you? Maybe it's sitting upright, making eye contact, or using a calm voice. Rehearse those specific actions, not just the idea of confidence. This kind of mental practice is powerful. You're reinforcing the neural pathways that support new behavior. This structured approach helps acting as if become an effective exposure, not a performance or pressure to get it right. You're gradually learning how to act in alignment with yourself, even when anxiety shows up. For now, reflect on the situations where anxiety exerts control in your life, preventing you from doing what you would like. You can review the hierarchies you developed in episode 43 to determine if the act as if method could be used. Generally, initial hierarchies are somewhat broad, so you may need to break a task up into manageable steps, as we already discussed. Write those into your hierarchy and order them in the same way as you did in developing the hierarchy. The companion audio to this episode, Train Your Mind to Act as If, can be helpful for mental rehearsal. However, keep in mind that even imagining situations that cause anxiety can be an exposure for some people. Then, when you are ready, with your therapist's direction, start with lower level items on your hierarchy and engage in the exposure. If exposures are new to you, be sure to review episode 38 for the method of using the anxiety rating scale when you are doing an exposure. Let's finish with another moment of mindful imagination. Take a slow breath, long and steady, and let your shoulders drop a little. Now bring to mind that same situation you imagined earlier, the one where anxiety tends to step in. See yourself responding with awareness and strength. You might still feel anxious, but you're steady, breathing through it, moving toward what matters anyway. Notice how capable you are in this image, not because the anxiety disappeared, but because you didn't let it define what you could do. You allowed yourself to be anxious while moving forward. Let that sense of possibility settle into your body for a moment. Feel the quiet pride that comes from choosing your direction. Take one last breath, slow, calm, and deliberate. And as you return to your day, carry with you the reminder you have what it takes to act, even when anxiety is present. When you're ready, gently open your eyes or bring your awareness back to your surroundings. Remember, the more you imagine yourself acting as if the anxiety isn't in control, the more easily you'll be able to try the behavior in real life situations. This kind of mental rehearsal builds the bridge between intention and action. Next time you're in a situation where anxiety shows up, consider asking yourself, what would I do right now if anxiety weren't here? And then take even the smallest step in that direction. You're not pretending, you're practicing who you truly are. without anxiety calling the shots. Until next time, keep practicing, keep breathing, and keep moving forward.